Fellowship of the Ring, the first of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series, Frodo, the unlikely hero, says to the wise wizard Gandalf, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." In the movie, this comes after Frodo has received the One Ring, and with it, immense responsibility to conquer evil and save his world of Middle-earth. And to this, Gandalf responds, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But it is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." And there's something poignant and relevant about this exchange between Frodo and Gandalf, and a little bit intimidating. What do we do with this time we've been given? What do we do when it seems like evil and unbridled power are winning over goodness, love, and mercy? And of course, there isn't one right path or next move to take, but I think a good place to start is looking within ourselves, reading Psalm 139, believing it, and living it, living into love and joy and mercy for ourselves as well as others, as a way to resist. When receiving treatment for cancer, feminist author and civil rights activist Audre Lorde wrote about the importance of not overextending herself and emphasizes that caring for herself isn't self-indulgence, but it's actually an act of political warfare. This was especially true for Lorde, a Black lesbian woman navigating cancer treatment in the 80s. For her, her survival itself was an act of resistance, but she gives us an important reminder to watch out for that overextension, and she reminds us that self-care itself is a subversive act. And not only to care for ourselves, but to do that so we can stand up for our neighbors and those who are being targeted and oppressed. And that's why, in our call to worship, Dr. Shaniqua Walker-Barnes actually calls self-care subversive and asks God to strengthen and empower us as we aim to truly care for ourselves. And so I looked it up, the definition of subversive, which is defined as to undermine the power and authority of an established system or institution. But why and how is self-care so subversive? As both Walker-Barnes and Lorde explain, the oppressor wants us to burn out, to overextend, to overexhaust, to not be able to keep up with all the breaking news, to turn to what they call doom scrolling, and go on social media rather than organizing and making change, to despair rather than doing the next right thing, to be too tired and too drained to truly love our neighbor and ourselves. The powers that be want to push a narrative of selfishness, not self-care or self-love, not a recognition of our divinely woven, fearfully and wonderfully created selves. And this selfishness that they're pushing makes me pretty angry, and I think it makes some of you angry too. And I often get stuck in the trap of asking myself, what's the point? What's the point in putting down my doom scrolling and getting out there to push back and protest people like Musk and Trump that have more money and power than I could ever even imagine? And we know they don't care. They don't care if I take care of myself or my neighbors. And they continue to use God's name as manipulation. They continue to use God as a pawn in their play for power and influence and indoctrination. And they will continue to use God to oppress and to hate. They will continue to use the teachings of Jesus and rake them through the mud. The teachings of love and care and community, they will keep manipulating to preach hate and individualism. And that's just a short overview. We know there are even more specific actions and executive orders and takeovers and defunding that's directly impacting our lives and the lives of the people we care for. And that makes me really angry. Because what can I do? I can say this here, but they're not going to listen to me. The people who follow his every word aren't going to listen. A bishop literally looked him in the eyes and asked him for mercy, and he didn't listen. And as David asks in the psalm, admittedly, a part I had never read enough to see was there, part of Psalm 139, he asked God, "Aren't your enemies my enemies? Can't I hate them and be angry at them for their wickedness and the ways that they manipulate you, God?" But David stops and thinks and looks inward. And he puts those pieces together that wait. If I am intimately known and created by God, if I was knit together by God's own hands, and God knows my innermost thoughts, my innermost everything, then didn't God do that for my enemies? Didn't God create them in their image? Didn't God knit them together too? And this is difficult to think about, to reconcile. And we see in the psalm that David struggles with this too. And he asks God to search him. And I think we need to ask God to search us, to help us not succumb to anger and hatred, to this wickedness as quoted in the psalm. Help us, God, to remember our own sacred worth and use that to uplift and empower those around us. Help us to care for ourselves so we can do the next right thing. We can do the good that we know how to do. And don't get me wrong, anger is okay. Anger is good and holy, and it fuels resistance and action. And if we think about Jesus got pretty angry, like a lot. Jesus literally flipped tables and caused us to flip tables. But it's easy to become overwhelmed by this table flipping anger, to run away from it because it's a little uncomfortable. And it's easy to stare at CNN and MSNBC for hours and scroll Facebook and Instagram until we're just too exhausted to do anything else. But we can't do this. Because you can't flip a table if you're physically, mentally, and spiritually depleted. You can't flip tables if you're sick with stress. You can't flip tables if you're pushing through chronic illness or cancer or sickness or migraines or depression without caring for yourself, like for real caring for yourself. You can't flip the tables if you're running away from them. And I'm not saying that this is easy. I've heard that preachers tend to preach to themselves, and that's definitely what's happening. Because this is something I struggle with a lot. I am not good at it, and I'm not very good at avoiding avoidance. And I'm admittedly not very good at self-care, although I am working on it. And especially in this political time, it seems even harder to push through and to step away from the screen and to think about what next right thing I can do. What do I do with this time I have been given? But again, that's exactly what we have to do. We have to love and care for ourselves, and again, we have to truly believe and live our miraculous creation. We have to find that scary, stubborn, subversive, sacred joy within ourselves, and that comes from our Creator. Caring for ourselves is an act of sacred resistance because, as Ginger Gaines Sorelli, who wrote a whole book on sacred resistance during the last Trump presidency, she says our resistance is sacred because it is driven not primarily by self-interest or fear or even only a benevolent wish for the good of an oppressed group. It is sacred because it is God at work in and through us. I'm going to say that again. Our resistance is sacred because it is driven not primarily by self-interest or fear, or even only a benevolent wish for the good of an oppressed group. It is sacred because it is God at work in and through us. God is at work because, as I tell the kids almost every week, God is always with us and always loves us. And I think this is something the kids have an easier time remembering and believing than we do as adults. We forget what the psalm tells us about how intimately connected we are with God. God knows our innermost parts, saw us as an unformed substance, and knit us together. God knows our path, and our pages are written before we even existed. Because, I'll say it again, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Amen.
Amen. Amen.